The dust hung in the air like a curtain of gold, suspended in the slanting rays of the Afghan sun. Forward operating base. Hammer sat in a valley carved between two ridgelines, a collection of plywood B-huts, HESCO barriers, and the constant hum of diesel generators that never quite drowned out the silence of the surrounding desert. It was 1600 hours, and the heat still pressed down like a physical weight, making the air shimmer above the gravel paths that connected the various buildings. Captain Sarah Chen moved through that shimmering heat with the careful economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy. She wore civilian contractor clothes, cargo pants, a faded tan shirt, and a baseball cap that shaded her face from the relentless sun. Her boots were worn but clean, military issue from years past, though no one here seemed to notice or care. To the combat troops rotating through Hammer, she was just another contractor, one of the faceless support personnel who kept the machinery of war running while the real soldiers did the real work. She carried a clipboard and a radio, inventory duty again, checking supply counts in the armory building. It was tedious work, the kind of task that made young privates complain and seasoned soldiers zone out. But Sarah approached it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Each weapon counted, each serial number verified, each discrepancy noted in her careful handwriting. The armory sergeant, a board specialist named Kowalski, sat in the corner scrolling through his phone, letting the contractor lady do all the work. "You want some water or something?" he asked without looking up, the kind of perfunctory offer made more from obligation than concern. "I'm good, thanks," Sarah replied, her voice quiet, almost soft. She didn't look up from her clipboard. The door banged open and 3 soldiers walked in, their gear still dusty from a patrol. They were part of Bravo Company, the infantry unit currently holding down operations in this sector. Sarah recognized the leader, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, young and confident, with the kind of swagger that came from surviving your first few firefights without losing anyone. Behind him came Sergeant First Class Torres and Staff Sergeant Mitchell, both older, more seasoned, but clearly deferring to their officer. "Kowalski, we need to zero some rifles," Webb announced. "Range is open, right?" "Yes, sir. Just need to sign out the—" "She can handle the paperwork," Webb said, jerking his chin towards Sarah without really looking at her. "That's what contractors are for, right? Paperwork?" Torres chuckled. Mitchell said nothing, but his expression carried a faint smirk. Sarah felt their eyes slide over her and then away, dismissing her as completely as if she'd been part of the furniture. She'd felt that look before, countless times. The look that said, civilian, contractor, not one of us, not important. "I'll get the sign-out sheet," she said quietly, moving to the desk. "Make sure you spell my name right," Webb said to Kowalski, ignoring Sarah entirely now. "Last contractor fucked it up and I had to redo the whole thing." "Will do, sir." Sarah placed the clipboard on the desk and began filling out the weapons sign-out form. Her handwriting was precise, each letter formed with careful attention. Military habits died hard, even years after you stopped wearing the uniform, especially when those habits had been beaten into you by schools where failure meant death. "You know what I don't get?" Webb was saying, leaning against a weapons rack. "These contractors make bank, right? Like serious money, but they can't even do basic paperwork correctly. My mom could do this job and she's a kindergarten teacher." "Different skill set, sir," Torres offered diplomatically. "Yeah, the skill set of showing up and collecting a paycheck." Webb laughed at his own joke. "I mean, look at her. Probably makes twice what I make, and what does she do? Counts rifles all day. Must be nice." Sarah's hand didn't pause. She finished the form, tore off the appropriate copy, and handed it to Kowalski. "You're all set," she said, her voice still quiet, still professional. "Rifles are in rack 7. Return them to the same position when you're done." Webb finally looked at her directly, his eyes scanning her face with the kind of casual assessment men sometimes give women they don't consider worth knowing. "You former military or something?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and found it amusing. "Yes, sir." "Let me guess. Signal Corps? Admin? Something like that." "Well, thanks for your service," Webb said, the phrase delivered with just enough irony to strip it of meaning. "Come on, guys, let's go punch some paper." They collected their rifles and left, the door slamming behind them. The armory fell quiet again except for the hum of the air conditioning unit struggling against the heat. Kowalski glanced up from his phone. "Don't let them get to you," he said. "Webb's not a bad guy, just young. Thinks he's hot shit because he's been in a few firefights." "It's fine," Sarah said. She picked up her clipboard and returned to her inventory work. "I've heard worse." And she had. Much worse. In places far more dangerous than a FOB in eastern Afghanistan. From men far more skilled than Lieutenant Marcus Webb would ever be. But that was a lifetime ago, in a world that existed behind classifications so deep that most of the people who knew those classifications were dead now. That world had left marks on her, scars on her body, ghosts in her mind, and skills that never quite faded no matter how much time passed or how hard you tried to bury them. The afternoon wore on. Sarah completed her inventory, filed her report, and walked back to her quarters through the same golden dust, the same oppressive heat. The bee hut she shared with 2 other contractors was mercifully empty. She sat on her cot and allowed herself a moment of stillness, feeling the ache in her back and shoulders that came from a day of standing and lifting and pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her eyes drifted to the footlocker at the end of her cot. She never opened it in front of others. Inside, beneath layers of clothes and personal items, was a small locked case. And inside that case, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, was the only thing she'd kept from her previous life. Not her medals. Those were in a storage unit somewhere in North Carolina. Not her commendations. Those had been classified anyway, burned or buried in Pentagon filing cabinets. Just one thing. A worn red beret with a distinctive flash, and a challenge coin that bore no unit designation. Just a number and a symbol that most people wouldn't recognize. She didn't open the footlocker. She never did unless she was alone and certain she'd remain that way. Instead, she lay back on the cot and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the FOB, generators humming, helicopters in the distance, the occasional shout of soldiers moving between buildings. These sounds were familiar, almost comforting. They reminded her of a time when she'd belonged somewhere, when she'd been part of something larger than herself. That evening, she ate dinner in the DFAC, the dining facility, at a table by herself. Other contractors nodded at her in passing. A few soldiers looked through her as if she wasn't there. She ate her food mechanically, not really tasting it, and returned to her quarters before dark. Later, lying in her cot with the lights out, she heard her roommates return, laughing about something that had happened in their office. They were good people, civilian engineers who worked on the FOB's infrastructure. They treated her politely, asked her questions sometimes, but there was always a distance. They could sense it, she thought, the way animals could sense storms coming. They knew, on some instinct level, that she was different, that she carried something with her that didn't belong in their world of construction schedules and supply chains. Sarah stared at the ceiling of the bee hut, listening to the generators, and thought about Lieutenant Webb's words. Must be nice. She almost smiled at that. If he only knew. If any of them knew. But they didn't, and they wouldn't. That was the point. She'd come here to disappear, to be invisible, to be the kind of person people looked past without seeing. And she'd succeeded. She was the contractor lady who did inventory. The quiet woman with the clipboard. Nobody important, nobody dangerous, nobody at all. The next morning began the same way. Every morning began. 05:30 wake up, quick shower in the communal facilities, coffee from the DFAC in a paper cup, and then to her small office in one of the administrative buildings. Her official title was Logistics Coordinator, which meant she tracked supplies, managed inventory, and ensured that the various units rotating through FOB Hammer had what they needed when they needed it. It was boring work, mind-numbing really, but it was also exactly what she'd wanted when she'd applied for this contract position 18 months ago. After 15 years of the other thing, the thing she didn't talk about, didn't think about if she could help it. Boring was a blessing. Boring meant no one was shooting at you. Boring meant you went to bed each night and woke up each morning without blood on your hands or screams in your ears. Boring meant being alive in a way that felt almost human. Her office was small but organized with military precision. Files were labeled and sorted. Her desk was clear except for her computer, a notepad, and a single photograph in a frame. her parents taken years ago at her college graduation. They were both gone now, her father to cancer 3 years back, her mother to a stroke just last year. She'd missed the funeral, been stuck on a contract in Iraq that she couldn't break. Another regret to add to the collection. She was reviewing requisition forms when the door opened without a knock. Lieutenant Webb stood in the doorway, and behind him was Captain James Holloway, the company commander for Bravo Company. Holloway was older than Webb, mid-30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from multiple deployments. His eyes were intelligent and careful, the eyes of someone who'd seen enough to know that things were rarely simple. "Ms. Chen?" Holloway said, his voice polite but carrying authority. "Yes, sir." Sarah stood, the military courtesy automatic despite her civilian status. "We need your help with something," Holloway continued. "We're planning an operation in Sector 3, and we need detailed information about a valley system in that area. Lieutenant Webb tells me you've been here longer than most of the military personnel. 18 months? "That's correct, sir." "Good. We need someone who knows the terrain, the local patterns, the tribal dynamics in that area. The intelligence shop is overworked, and frankly, I'd rather hear from someone who's been on the ground here for an extended period." He paused. "Webb mentioned you were former military. What was your MOS?" "Military occupational specialty." The question was natural, expected. Sarah had prepared an answer years ago, one that was technically true while revealing nothing important. "Signals intelligence, sir. I was an analyst." Webb smirked. "Told you, sir. Desk job." Holloway ignored him, his eyes still on Sarah. "But you know the area? Sector 3, specifically the Tangi Valley?" Sarah hesitated for just a fraction of a second. The Tangi Valley. She knew it all right. Knew it better than anyone on this FOB. Probably better than anyone currently deployed in Afghanistan. She'd spent 3 months in that valley, years ago, during operations that didn't appear in any official records. She'd walked every trail, memorized every compound, knew which villages supported the Taliban and which ones just wanted to be left alone. But knowing it meant revealing more than she wanted to reveal. "I've studied the maps extensively," she said carefully. "And I've debriefed soldiers who've operated there. I can provide you with the information you need." "Perfect," Holloway said. He pulled out a map case and spread a tactical map across her desk. "Here's what we're looking at." For the next hour, Sarah briefed them on the Tangi Valley. She kept her information clinical, citing map coordinates and intelligence reports, being careful to attribute everything to sources that made sense for a logistics contractor to have access to. She described the compound layouts, the typical enemy positions, the best routes in and out. She explained the tribal dynamics, which families were influential, where the power structures lay beneath the surface. Holloway listened intently, asking sharp questions. Webb looked increasingly bored, clearly having expected a shorter, simpler meeting. At one point, he interrupted. "Sir, with all due respect, we can get most of this from the S2 shop." "I don't see why we're—" "The S2 shop has analysts who've been here for 3 months. Holloway cut him off. "Ms. Chen has been here 18 months, and she clearly knows her stuff. Keep listening, Lieutenant." Webb's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. Sarah continued her briefing, walking them through the valley's geography, the likely enemy strength, the best positions for overwatch and fire support. She spoke calmly, professionally, using military terminology that came automatically despite her civilian clothes. When she finished, Holloway studied her for a long moment. "That was excellent," he said. "You've got a good tactical mind for someone who worked in signals intelligence. Thank you, sir. We move out in 72 hours. I'd like you to continue providing analysis support as the operation develops." "Of course, sir." After they left, Sarah sat back in her chair and released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were steady, but she could feel the familiar tightness in her chest, the old alertness rising like a tide. The Tangi Valley, of all the places they could have chosen for an operation. She closed her eyes and was immediately back there, 5 years ago. Different name then, different unit, different everything. The night infiltration through the high passes, the compound assault at dawn, the running firefight through the terraced fields, the smell of cordite and blood, the weight of the rifle in her hands, The recoil against her shoulder, the controlled breathing between shots. The Taliban fighter appearing in a doorway, his AK coming up, her round taking him in the chest before he could fire. The next one, and the next, and the next, until her magazine was empty and the compound was silent except for the ringing in her ears. She'd received a commendation for that operation. Secret, of course, filed away somewhere in a Pentagon basement, never to see daylight. It had been one of dozens of missions over 15 years, but it stood out because it had been her last. The last time she'd worn the uniform that didn't exist, carried the weapons that weren't issued, hunted the targets that were never officially sanctioned. After that mission, she'd retired. Officially, she'd left Army intelligence after serving her time. Unofficially, she'd left a program that recruited from special operations units and trained soldiers to operate in the shadows, in the spaces between law and necessity, doing the things that needed to be done but could never be acknowledged. She'd been good at it. Too good, maybe. Good enough that it had started to change her in ways she didn't like. Good enough that she'd started to see the world through a scope, calculating ranges and wind speed instead of seeing people. Good enough that she'd stopped sleeping well, stopped laughing easily, stopped feeling much of anything except the cold clarity that came before pulling a trigger. So she'd walked away, signed the non-disclosure agreements, accepted the mandatory counseling, and disappeared into the contractor world where she could be invisible and boring and slowly remember how to be human again. Except now Bravo Company was going into the Tangi Valley, and she knew what they'd find there. She knew the terrain better than their maps showed. She knew the enemy better than their intelligence briefings described, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that their operation was going to go sideways. The question was, what would she do when it did? The 72 hours passed in a blur of briefings and preparations. Sarah provided additional analysis, answering questions from Holloway's platoon leaders, helping them refine their plans. She stayed professional, stayed in her lane, offered information without pushing too hard or revealing too much. But she watched everything, watched how they planned to move, where they'd set their overwatch positions, how they'd configured their fire support. And she saw the problems, saw them clearly, like reading a book she'd written herself. Their primary overwatch position was too low, wouldn't have good visibility into the valley floor where the engagement would most likely happen. Their route took them past 3 compounds that they'd assessed as abandoned, but that she knew, from personal experience, were often used as temporary Taliban staging areas. Their extraction plan relied on a landing zone that could easily be interdicted by a few fighters with RPGs in the high ground. She pointed out some of these issues, carefully, respectfully, framing them as possibilities rather than certainties. Holloway listened and made some adjustments. Webb rolled his eyes and made it clear he thought she was being overcautious. The other officers were somewhere in between, polite but clearly seeing her as a contractor with a map, not someone who'd actually operated in that valley. The night before the operation, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the generators and the distant sounds of the FOB preparing for the next day's mission. Finally, at 0300, she got up and walked to her office. She sat at her desk in the darkness, not turning on the lights. The building was empty, the hallways silent. She pulled out her bottom desk drawer and removed a folder that she kept locked inside. It contained nothing classified, nothing that would violate her NDAs. Just maps, personal maps that she'd drawn herself during her time here as a contractor, annotated with observations and notes. She spread one of the maps across her desk, the Tangi Valley marked in careful detail. Then she began to write, a list of concerns, specific tactical recommendations that went beyond what she'd shared in the briefings. She knew she shouldn't. Knew that the level of detail would raise questions. But the thought of those soldiers walking into danger that she could help them avoid made her chest tight. She wrote for an hour, then stopped, read what she'd written, and slowly, carefully, tore it up. It wasn't her place anymore, wasn't her job. She'd left that world, left those responsibilities. She was a contractor now, a civilian, invisible and unimportant. She couldn't save them from their own plans, couldn't protect them from their own inexperience. All she could do was what she'd already done, provide the information they'd asked for, and hope they used it wisely. She returned to her quarters and lay in her cot, not sleeping, waiting for dawn. At 0600 she watched from the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, as Bravo Company rolled out of the FOB in their MRAPs and Humvees, kicking up dust as they headed toward the Tangi Valley. Lieutenant Webb was visible in one of the lead vehicles, his expression eager, ready for action. Captain Holloway looked more thoughtful, more aware of the risks, but confident in his plan. Sarah stood in the back of the TOC, her clipboard in hand, officially there to coordinate logistics support for the operation. She watched the blue icons on the digital map display as the convoy moved north, climbing into the mountains. She listened to the radio chatter, the calm professional voices of soldiers doing their jobs. And she waited, because she knew, with the certainty born of experience and blood, that something was going to go wrong. The morning stretched into afternoon in the TOC, time marked by radio checks and position reports. Sarah stood against the back wall, her clipboard forgotten in her hands, eyes fixed on the blue icons moving across the digital map display. The air conditioning hummed, struggling against the heat radiating from all the electronic equipment packed into the plywood building. Officers and NCOs moved around her, coordinating various aspects of the operation, their voices professional and calm. Viking 6, this is Hammer TOC. Radio check, over. Hammer TOC, Viking 6, Lima Charlie. Continuing movement to phase line Delta, over. Captain Holloway's voice came through clear and steady. Sarah tracked their progress, mentally overlaying her own knowledge of the terrain onto the simplified map display. They were making good time, following the route they'd briefed, moving in good order. So far, everything was going according to plan, which meant in Sarah's experience that something was about to go very wrong. The TOC was staffed by the Battalion S3 shop, operations officers and specialists who coordinated missions across multiple FOBs and units. Major Richard Grimes, the S3 officer, stood near the map display, coffee cup in hand, looking relaxed. This was a routine mission, after all. Company-sized operation, good intelligence, experienced commander. Nothing they hadn't done dozens of times before. But Sarah couldn't shake the tension building in her shoulders, the old alertness that had kept her alive through too many missions to count. She'd learned long ago to trust that feeling, that premonition that came before things went sideways. It had saved her life in Helmand, in Kunar, in places whose names she couldn't speak, and it was screaming at her now. She glanced at the clock. 14:23 hours. Bravo Company should be approaching the valley floor, setting up their overwatch positions, preparing to move on their objectives. According to the timeline, they'd reach their first compound in about 30 minutes. At 14:37 hours, the radio crackled. Hammer TOC, this is Viking 6. Contact north, compound 217. Taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate fire support. Over. The TOC erupted into controlled chaos. Major Grimes strode to the map display, his coffee cup forgotten on a desk. Radio operators began coordinating with artillery and air support. Sarah's hands tightened on her clipboard, her body absolutely still while her mind raced through what she knew about Compound 217 and the surrounding area. Viking 6, Hammer TOC, copy contact, grid November, Delta 428659. Artillery has your position, stand by for fire mission, over. Hammer TOC, negative on artillery. We've got locals in the compound. Appears to be civilians caught in crossfire. Enemy positions are RPG. Enemy in the high ground north and east, we're... The transmission cut off in a burst of static, then came back. Casualties. Say again, we have 2 urgent casualties. Vehicle disabled. Request immediate CASEVAC. Over. Sarah was already moving, stepping closer to the map display, her eyes scanning the terrain. She knew those positions, knew exactly where the Taliban were shooting from, could visualize the entire battle space as clearly as if she were standing there. The high ground to the north was a terraced hillside, perfect cover and concealment, with fields of fire that covered the entire approach to Compound 217. The eastern positions would be in the tree line near the irrigation canal, where fighters could shoot and displace quickly. Bravo Company had walked into a classic L-shaped ambush, and they were taking fire from positions that were nearly impossible to suppress without air support or indirect fire. But they couldn't use artillery because of the civilians, and air support would take time to arrive. "Sir," she said quietly, "the eastern positions." "Not now," Major Grimes snapped, his attention fixed on the radio. He keyed his handset. "Viking 6, Hammer talk, dust off is inbound, ETA 20 minutes. Can you provide landing zone security over?" Negative, we cannot provide LZ security. Still in heavy contact, enemy fire from..." More static, the sound of automatic weapons fire audible in the background. "Overwatch position is taking fire. Viking 2 has 3 casualties now. We need support now." 20 minutes. Sarah knew what could happen in 20 minutes. Knew how many soldiers could die while helicopters spun up and pilots coordinated clearances and medical teams prepared. She'd been in firefights where 20 seconds felt like 20 hours, where the gap between having support and needing support was measured in heartbeats and bullet impacts. She stepped closer to Major Grimes. "Sir, if I could make a suggestion." "I said not now." He didn't even look at her. "Your logistics, this is a tactical situation. Stay back and let us handle it." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she stepped back. The TOC continued its coordinated dance of command and control, officers and NCOs working the problem, trying to get support to soldiers who were dying in a valley that Sarah knew better than anyone in this room. But she was just the contractor lady, the quiet woman with the clipboard, and this wasn't her world anymore. The radio traffic continued, increasingly desperate. "Hammer talk, Viking 2. We're pinned down. Can't maneuver. Taking accurate fire from the high ground. We need..." The voice cut off, replaced by someone else. Younger. More panicked. "This is Viking 2 Charlie. Sergeant Mitchell is hit. He's hit bad. We need that casevac now." Sarah's hands were shaking. Not from fear. She'd moved past fear years ago, in training courses that broke most of the people who tried them. She was shaking from the effort of standing still, of staying silent, of keeping herself locked behind the wall of civilian invisibility that she'd built so carefully. But she could see it all in her mind, could see exactly where those soldiers were, exactly where the enemy fire was coming from, exactly what needed to happen to save them. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the plan currently being executed in the talk wasn't going to work fast enough. At 14:48 hours, another voice came on the radio, this one frighteningly calm despite the chaos audible in the background. "Hammer talk. This is Viking 6 Alpha. Lieutenant Webb is down. I have assumed command. We are attempting to break contact, but we cannot move without covering fire. Requesting any available support. Grid November Delta 428659, over. Sergeant First Class Torres." Sarah recognized his voice, heard the steel underneath the words. Torres was good, experienced, capable. But capable wasn't enough when you were caught in an L-shaped ambush with multiple casualties and no support. Major Grimes was coordinating with the Air Force liaison now, trying to expedite close air support, but Sarah heard the timeline. 15 minutes for the aircraft to arrive, additional time to identify targets and clear the engagement. Too long. Far too long. She looked at the map display, at the blue icons representing American soldiers, at the terrain she knew with intimate familiarity. She thought about Lieutenant Webb, who'd dismissed her as a contractor who counted rifles. She thought about Captain Holloway, who'd listened to her briefing but hadn't taken all her recommendations. She thought about all the young soldiers in Bravo Company, kids mostly, who'd joined the Army to serve their country, and now were bleeding in an Afghan valley because their intelligence wasn't good enough, and their plans weren't thorough enough, and their support wasn't fast enough. And she thought about the promise she'd made to herself 18 months ago, when she'd left her old life behind. The promise to stay invisible, to stay quiet, to never again be the person who operated in shadows and made decisions about life and death. But promises meant nothing if soldiers died while you kept them. Sarah walked to the map display, stepped beside Major Grimes, and spoke in a voice that was still quiet but carried an edge of authority that hadn't been there before. "Sir, there's a position that can provide overwatch on their entire AO. Grid November Delta 429672, elevated terrain, approximately 800 meters from the contact area, with clear lines of sight to all the enemy firing positions." Grimes glanced at her, annoyed. How do you know that? Because I've been there, sir. And I can tell you exactly how to neutralize those enemy positions if you'll listen. Something in her voice must have penetrated, because Grimes actually looked at her now, really looked at her for the first time. You said you were signals intelligence, an analyst. I was a lot of things, sir, and right now you need my help, whether you want to admit it or not. The radio crackled again. Hammer talk, Viking 6 Alpha. We have 4 urgent casualties now. Situation is critical, I say again. Critical. We need... The transmission dissolved into static and the sound of explosions. Major Grimes stared at her for one more second, then made his decision. Talk, he said. Sarah leaned over the map display, her finger tracing positions with absolute confidence. The enemy has positions here, here, and here. The primary threat is the PKM position in the terraced hillside to the north. They've got the high ground and they're pinning down Viking 2's element. Secondary threat is the RPG team near the tree line to the east. They're targeting vehicles and anything that tries to maneuver. We can't use artillery because of civilians. You don't need artillery, Sarah cut him off. You need precision fire from a position that can see the entire battle space. That position is here. She tapped the grid she'd given him. If you can get someone with a long gun to that location, they can suppress or eliminate the enemy positions and allow Viking elements to break contact. We don't have snipers positioned there. We'd have to extract a team from another mission, get them moving. That's 30 minutes minimum. I know, Sarah said quietly. That's why I'm going. The TOC went quiet. Every officer and specialist within earshot turned to look at her. Major Grimes's expression went from annoyed to incredulous. You're a contractor, he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. You're not a sniper. You're not military. I'm the person who can get there in 10 minutes and save those soldiers, Sarah interrupted. Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it now, the kind of certainty that came from years of making hard decisions under fire. And unless you have a better option in the next 60 seconds, that's what I'm going to do. This is insane. I can't authorize. Then don't authorize it. I'm a civilian contractor, remember? You have no authority over my actions outside the wire. I'll take responsibility for my own decisions. She was already moving toward the door, her mind shifting into a mode she hadn't accessed in years, calculating distances and timelines, running through gear she'd need, routes she'd take. Behind her, she heard Major Grimes shouting something, but she didn't stop. The afternoon sun hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside the TOC. She walked quickly across the FOB, her movements purposeful now, no longer the slow shuffle of someone trying to be invisible. She had 10 minutes to get to her B hut, 5 minutes to prepare, and then she needed to be moving. Her roommates weren't there. They'd be in their office, working through the afternoon. Good. She locked the door and went to her footlocker, pulling it open, digging through the layers of clothes and personal items until she reached the locked case at the bottom. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of similar moments. The case opened. Inside, beneath the red beret and challenge coin, were items she'd told herself she'd never touch again. But some things, once learned, couldn't be unlearned. Some skills once developed stayed with you forever. She pulled out the weapons cleaning kit, still sealed and unused. Beneath it was a small bag containing items that weren't standard issue for contractors. A rangefinder, a ballistic calculator, a kestrel weather meter. Tools of a trade she'd tried to leave behind. She changed quickly, stripping off her contractor clothes and pulling on cargo pants and a long-sleeve shirt in earth tones. She laced up her boots tight, checked her gear with practiced efficiency. Then she returned to the locked case and pulled out the last item, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. A rifle. Not her service weapon. That had been turned in when she'd left the program. This was something she'd acquired carefully and legally through contractor channels, a precision rifle that she'd told herself was just for personal security, just in case. A Remington 700 in .308, with a Leupold Mark IV scope and a Harris bipod. Nothing fancy, nothing military issue. Just a good rifle that she'd zeroed and maintained, but never fired in anger. Until now. She loaded 6 magazines, 120 rounds total, more than she should ever need, but you always brought more ammunition than you thought you'd use. Grabbed her rangefinder, her weather meter, her ballistics calculator. slung the rifle across her back in a drag bag to keep it concealed until she was outside the FOB. One last item. She opened the case and took out the challenge coin, the one with no unit designation, just a number and a symbol. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, remembering what it represented. Then she slipped it into her pocket. Her reflection in the small mirror mounted above her footlocker showed someone different than the contractor lady who'd been counting rifles that morning. Her eyes were harder now, focused in a way they hadn't been in months. This was the person she'd tried to bury, the operator who moved in shadows and made the hard calls. But soldiers were dying, and she was the only one who could help them. Sarah Chen walked out of her bee-hut and into the burning Afghan afternoon, carrying a rifle and the weight of a past she'd hoped to never revisit. Sarah moved through the FOB with purpose, no longer the invisible contractor, but not quite revealing her full intent. The rifle was concealed in the drag bag slung across her back, looking like any other piece of equipment a contractor might carry. She'd learned long ago that the key to moving unnoticed wasn't to hide. It was to look like you belonged exactly where you were, doing exactly what you were doing. The main gate was controlled by military police, soldiers whose job was to monitor everything coming in and out of the FOB. Sarah approached with the same calm confidence she'd carried into 100 other situations where appearing uncertain would raise questions. She had her contractor ID ready, along with a movement authorization form she'd filled out earlier in the week for a routine site survey. Not for today, but close enough that a quick glance wouldn't catch the discrepancy. The MP on duty was a young specialist, maybe 22, bored and hot in his body armor. He glanced at her ID, then at the form, then back at her face. "You're going outside the wire?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was unusual enough to merit attention. "Equipment survey at the satellite checkpoint," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough bureaucratic annoyance to make it sound tedious. "Generator issues. Should only take an hour. You got security? Local nationals are meeting me there. It's inside the secure perimeter." All lies, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd spent years lying to people much more suspicious than a bored MP at a FOB gate. The specialist looked at the form again, clearly deciding whether this was worth making an issue over. Sarah waited, her expression patient, her body language relaxed. The rifle in the drag bag weighed about 15 pounds, but she held it as if it weighed nothing, just another piece of equipment, nothing unusual. "All right," the specialist said finally, waving her through. "Stay on the main route, and if you hear anything, get back here immediately." "Will do," Sarah said, and walked through the gate. The valley spread out before her, all dust and rocks and the distant mountains rising like broken teeth against the pale sky. The heat pressed down, easily over 110 degrees, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned metal surfaces into burners. Sarah had walked in worse heat, carrying more weight, in places more dangerous than this. But it had been years, and her body wasn't as young as it had been during her operator days. Didn't matter. The soldiers didn't have years. They barely had minutes. She moved at a steady pace, not running. That would attract attention from the guard towers, but walking with purpose, angling away from the official checkpoints and toward the broken terrain to the northeast. The grid coordinate she'd given Major Grimes was burned into her memory. November Delta 4296722. A ridgeline approximately 4 kilometers from the FOB, elevated enough to provide overwatch on the Tangi Valley, remote enough that Taliban scouts wouldn't have eyes on it. She'd been there before, years ago, during an operation that didn't exist. Had spent 3 hours on that ridgeline providing overwatch while her team hit a compound below. She remembered every rock, every scrub bush, every angle of fire. Some memories faded with time. Others stayed sharp as broken glass, cutting you whenever you touched them. The terrain was brutal, all loose scree and hidden ravines, the kind of ground that punished every step. Sarah pushed forward, breathing steady, letting her body fall into the rhythm of movement that had been drilled into her through selection courses and training rotations. One foot in front of the other, weapons secure, eyes scanning for threats. The radio in her pocket crackled. She'd taken a spare from the Tiok, probably not noticed in the chaos. The volume was low, but she could hear the transmissions. "Hammer Tiok, Viking 6 Alpha. We've established a defensive perimeter, but we're still taking effective fire. 4 urgent casualties, 2 more walking wounded. Ammunition status is yellow. Request immediate support, over. Torres's voice, still calm, but with an edge now. Soldiers learned to control their fear, but you couldn't hide the stress that came from watching your people bleed while waiting for help that might come too late. Sarah checked her watch. 15:02 hours. She'd been walking for 14 minutes. The ridgeline was still 2 kilometers ahead, across terrain that would slow her down. She pushed harder, feeling her heart rate climb, sweat soaking through her shirt despite the dry air. Her mind was calculating constantly now, the old skills coming back like muscle memory. Wind speed. She'd check that when she reached position, but the valley typically had a steady westerly breeze in the afternoon, maybe 8 to 10 knots. Temperature. Call it 112 degrees Fahrenheit, which would affect bullet trajectory at longer ranges. Elevation. She'd be approximately 300 meters higher than the targets, which meant she'd need to adjust her holds accordingly. The drag bag bounced against her back, the rifle inside shifting slightly with each step. She'd zeroed the weapon at 100 yards on a makeshift range outside the FOB, just target practice to stay current, telling herself it was just a hobby, but she'd zeroed it carefully, professionally, the way you zeroed a weapon you might need to depend on. Old habits. At 15:15 hours, she reached the base of the ridgeline. The slope was steep, loose rock and sparse vegetation, the kind of climb that required both hands. Sarah slung the drag bag higher on her back and started up, using rocks for handholds, her boots slipping occasionally on the scree. Her breathing was labored now, her legs burning, but she didn't slow down. The radio crackled again. Hammer talk, Viking 6 Alpha, air support ETA. Viking 6 Alpha, hammer talk, CAS is 12 minutes out. Dust off is 10 minutes out. Hold your position, over. Copy, holding position. A pause, then, quieter. We've got another man down. That's 5 urgent now. 12 minutes for air support, 10 minutes for medical evacuation. But how many more soldiers would be hit in those 12 minutes? How many would bleed out in those 10 minutes waiting for the helicopter? Sarah pushed harder, her hands scraped raw from the rocks, her legs screaming, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. She'd been through worse. The final ruck march in selection had been 20 miles with an 80-pound pack in under 6 hours. She'd completed it in 5 hours and 37 minutes, one of only 3 women who'd passed that particular course that year. This was just 4 kilometers with a 15-pound rifle. She could do this, had to do this. At 15:23 hours, she crested the ridgeline. The valley spread out below her like a tactical map come to life. She could see the whole battle space, the compound where Bravo Company was pinned down, the disabled vehicle smoking on the road, the positions where Taliban fighters were engaging from cover. Exactly as she'd visualized it, exactly as she'd known it would be. Sarah dropped to her belly, pulling the rifle from the drag bag with practiced efficiency. She deployed the bipod, settled into a prone shooting position behind a cluster of rocks that provided cover and concealment. Her hands moved through the ritual automatically. Chamber check, scope caps off, parallax adjustment, elevation turret check. The Leupold scope brought the battlefield into sharp focus. She could see American soldiers behind their vehicles, returning fire but clearly unable to maneuver. She could see the muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions, 2 PKM machine gun nests in the terraced hillside to the north, an RPG team in the tree line to the east, several riflemen scattered through the compounds. She pulled out her rangefinder and began marking targets, calling out distances in a whisper, old habits from spotter work. PKM position 1, 847 meters. PKM position 2, 912 meters. RPG team, 783 meters. Long shots, but not impossible. Not even particularly difficult for someone with her training and experience. She'd made shots over 1,000 meters in worse conditions, with worse equipment, with lives depending on accuracy. Sarah pulled out her Kestrel weather meter and took readings. Wind speed, 9 knots from the west. Temperature, 114 degrees. Elevation difference, 287 meters. She fed the data into her mental calculator. She could do the ballistics math in her head, another skill that never faded, and made her adjustments. Elevation turret, up 4 minutes of angle. Windage, right 2 minutes of angle. She settled behind the rifle, feeling it nestle into her shoulder like an old friend. The stock was familiar against her cheek, the scope picture clear and bright. Her breathing slowed automatically, the shallow breaths of a shooter preparing to engage. Her heart rate dropped, the physiological response to stress giving way to the cold calm that had made her one of the best in her unit. Through the scope, she could see an American soldier moving between vehicles, exposing himself to drag a wounded man to cover. Brave, stupid, about to get himself killed. Sarah's crosshairs settled on the PKM position in the northern hillside, the one with the best angle on that soldier. She could see the Taliban fighter behind the machine gun, could see the assistant gunner feeding the belt, could see the muzzle swinging toward the American who was pulling his buddy to safety. Her finger moved to the trigger, taking up the slack. 2 pounds of pressure, smooth and steady. The scope's reticle held steady on the machine gunner's center mass, the crosshairs not wavering despite the distance, despite the wind, despite the years since she'd done this for real. But she didn't fire, because firing would reveal her position, would announce to everyone, American and Taliban alike, that there was a sniper on this ridgeline, would raise questions she wasn't ready to answer, would expose the person she'd tried so hard to bury. The American soldier finished dragging his wounded buddy to cover, somehow not getting hit. Lucky. But luck ran out eventually, especially in firefights. Sarah's radio crackled. "Hammer talk, Viking 6 Alpha. We've got another man hit. That's 6 urgent casualties. We need that support now." 6 casualties. 6 soldiers bleeding, maybe dying, while she hesitated because she was worried about questions, about exposure, about maintaining the fiction that she was just a contractor who counted rifles. In her mind, she heard the voice of her first instructor at the program, a grizzled master sergeant who'd been operating in shadows since before Sarah was born. "The mission always comes first," he'd told her class. "Not your ego, not your safety, not your comfort. Soldiers are depending on you to do your job, and your job is to keep them alive. Everything else is noise." Sarah's finger settled on the trigger again. This time, she didn't hesitate. The rifle fired, the recoil punching into her shoulder, the muzzle blast loud even through her ear protection. She rode the recoil, brought the scope back on target, saw the Taliban machine gunner jerk backward, the PKM going silent. 1 down. She shifted aim, found the assistant gunner scrambling for the weapon. Another shot, another body falling away from the machine gun. 2 down. The RPG team in the tree line was moving now, 1 man carrying the launcher, another carrying reload rounds. Sarah tracked them through the scope, led the runner slightly to account for movement and wind, and fired. The man with the launcher went down. She cycled the bolt, acquired the second man, fired again. Both targets neutralized. 4 shots, 4 targets down in less than 20 seconds. Below, the battlefield was changing. The American soldiers were reacting to the sudden silence from the enemy positions that had been pinning them down, starting to maneuver, returning fire toward the remaining Taliban positions. But those positions were scattered, harder to suppress without taking casualties. Sarah continued engaging, methodical and precise. PKM position 2 in the northern hillside, gunner down, assistant gunner down. Rifleman in compound window, 1 shot, target eliminated. Another rifleman trying to flank the American position, anticipated his movement, led him through a doorway, fired as he emerged. Clean hit. She was in the zone now, that state of absolute focus where everything else fell away and there was only the rifle, the target, the wind, the shot. Her breathing was automatic, her trigger press perfect every time, her bolt manipulations smooth and fast. Each shot was deliberate, each target carefully selected to have maximum impact on the battle below. The Taliban fighters were reacting now, trying to find cover, trying to locate the source of the precision fire that was systematically destroying their ambush. But they were looking in the wrong places, scanning the valley floor and the nearby compounds, not thinking to look up at the distant ridgeline where a lone shooter was dismantling their operation 1 trigger press at a time. Sarah's magazine ran dry. She dropped it, slapped in a fresh one, charged the bolt, and was back on target in under 3 seconds. More riflemen visible now, moving between compounds, trying to reposition. She engaged them in sequence, near to far, highest threat to lowest threat, the target priority list appearing in her mind as naturally as breathing. Through the scope, she saw an American soldier, looked like Captain Holloway, standing to direct his men, visible for just a moment. A Taliban fighter appeared on a rooftop, AK coming up, aimed at Holloway's position. Sarah put her crosshairs on the fighter's chest and fired before he could pull his trigger. The Taliban fighter dropped, and Holloway disappeared back into cover, probably never knowing how close he'd come to dying. The radio traffic was changing now, confusion replacing panic. Viking 6 Alpha, where the hell is that fire coming from? Someone's lighting these guys up. Unknown, unknown. Maintain your positions. Continue to engage targets of opportunity. Hammer talk. Viking 6 Alpha. Enemy fire is decreasing significantly. We're able to maneuver now. Moving to secure the LZ for dust-off. Over. Sarah kept shooting. She'd learned long ago that firefights weren't won by the side that shot the most. They were won by the side that shot the best. Every round she fired eliminated a threat, changed the tactical calculus, bought the Americans below more time and more options. Another magazine empty. She dropped it, loaded the third one, kept working. The Taliban were breaking now, the survivors abandoning their positions, fleeing into the compounds and ravines where they could disappear. Smart. The ambush had failed, and staying to fight would just mean dying to an unseen sniper who didn't miss. At 15:34 hours, 11 minutes after Sarah had fired her first shot, the battlefield went quiet. Through her scope, Sarah watched the American soldiers consolidating their position, establishing security, treating their wounded. She watched the medical evacuation helicopter come in, watched the urgent casualties loaded aboard, watched it lift off and bank away toward the FOB. She watched Captain Holloway and Sergeant First Class Torres organizing their men, counting heads, checking ammunition status, all alive, all moving. The wounded would make it. She could tell by how the medics were working, efficient but not frantic. The mission hadn't been a success exactly, but it also hadn't been the disaster it would have been without intervention. Sarah safed her weapon, collected her brass, never leave evidence if you could help it, and began breaking down her position. She'd fired 43 rounds in 11 minutes. 43 shots. Maybe 35 confirmed hits, the rest covering fire or suppression. Not her best work, but good enough. The radio crackled one more time. Hammer talk. Viking 6 Alpha. All wounded are on dust-off. We're preparing to move back to base, but I need to know who the hell was providing overwatch. That shooter saved our lives. Sarah didn't wait to hear the response. She packed her rifle back into the drag bag, slung it across her back, and started down the ridgeline. Her legs were shaking now, adrenaline wearing off, replaced by the familiar exhaustion that came after action. Her hands were steady, though. They were always steady. The walk back to the FOB seemed longer than the walk out, every step a reminder that she'd just broken the promise she'd made to herself. She wasn't invisible anymore. Wasn't just a contractor. Somewhere in that battlefield below, soldiers were asking questions, wondering about the sniper who'd appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. And in the talk, Major Grimes would be putting pieces together, remembering the contractor who'd walked out of his operations center with a grid coordinate and a promise to help. The sun was lower now, the afternoon heat starting to break, long shadows stretching across the valley. Sarah walked through them, her rifle hidden, her identity concealed, but knowing that concealment wouldn't last. Couldn't last. Not after what she'd just done. At the FOB gate, the same MP specialist was on duty. He looked at her with mild surprise. "You're back early," he said. "Thought you'd be out there longer." "Generator wasn't as bad as they thought," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, conversational. No sign of the firefight she'd just participated in, the lives she'd just taken, the soldiers she'd just saved. Fixed it quick. Cool. Head on through. Sarah walked back into the FOB, back to being invisible, back to being nobody important. But she could feel the weight of the challenge coin in her pocket. The weight of 43 rounds fired. The weight of a past that had just crashed back into her present with the force of a rifle shot. She returned to her bee hut, locked the door, and sat on her cot. The rifle lay across her lap, still warm from firing. Her hands were dirty, streaked with dust and gun oil. She should clean the weapon, should shower, should prepare for whatever was coming next. Instead, she just sat there, staring at nothing, feeling the familiar emptiness that always came after action. The moment of clarity during the shooting, when everything made sense and every decision was clear, was gone. Now there were just questions, consequences, and the knowledge that she'd stepped back into a world she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Outside, she heard the sound of vehicles returning, Bravo Company, back from their mission, bringing their wounded and their questions. Sarah closed her eyes and waited for the knock on her door that she knew would come, because invisibility was over. The contractor lady who counted rifles was gone, and everyone was about to learn who she really was. The knock came at 1847 hours, just as the sun was setting and the FOB was beginning its transition from day operations to night security posture. Sarah had cleaned her rifle, showered, changed back into contractor clothes, and was sitting at the small desk in her B-hut, writing a detailed after-action report that no one had asked for, but that her training demanded she create anyway. Old habits. She'd known the knock was coming, had known it from the moment she'd fired that first shot. You didn't save a company-sized element from a complex ambush and expect to remain anonymous. The only question had been timing. How long before they connected the mysterious Overwatch fire to the contractor who'd walked out of the TOC with a grid coordinate and a rifle? Not long, apparently. "Come in," Sarah said, her voice calm. The door opened and Major Grimes entered, followed by Captain Holloway and Sergeant First Class Torres. All three men wore expressions that mixed curiosity, suspicion, and, in Holloway's case, something that might have been respect. They'd cleaned up since the mission, but Holloway's uniform still had dust ground into the fabric, and Torres had a field dressing visible on his left forearm where shrapnel had caught him. Major Grimes closed the door and stood there for a moment, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Sarah set down her pen and waited. She'd been interrogated by intelligence officers, debriefed by Pentagon officials, and questioned by people whose job was to break you. A tired major in a plywood B-hut didn't intimidate her. "Ms. Chen," Grimes began, "we need to talk about what happened today." "I assume this is about the Overwatch fire during Bravo Company's operation," Sarah said evenly. Holloway spoke up, his voice quiet but intense. "That wasn't just Overwatch fire. That was some of the most precise long-range shooting I've ever seen. 43 rounds fired, and from what we could tell, at least 35 hits at distances exceeding 800 meters, in high wind, at elevated targets." He paused. "That's not contractor work. That's not even regular military work. That's specialized operator-level skill. Someone saved our asses," Torres added bluntly. "We were about to get overrun, 6 wounded, running low on ammunition, no support available for at least 10 minutes. Then someone who knew exactly what they were doing, started dropping Taliban fighters like they were paper targets. Whoever that was, they're the reason all my soldiers made it home alive." Sarah looked at each of them in turn, then back to Major Grimes. "What do you want me to say, sir?" "I want you to tell me the truth," Grimes said, "because right now, the only person who knew that grid coordinate, the only person who was unaccounted for during the exact time frame of that Overwatch fire, and the only person on this FOB with any apparent knowledge of precision rifle work is sitting right in front of me, pretending to be a logistics contractor." Silence filled the small room. Sarah could hear the generators outside, the distant sound of soldiers moving through the FOB, the faint crackle of radios. She'd prepared for this moment, had several cover stories ready, could probably deflect enough to maintain plausible deniability, but she was tired. Tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of being invisible. And these men had earned the truth, even if the truth complicated everything. "My name is Sarah Chen," she said quietly. "Formerly Captain Sarah Chen, United States Army. I served 15 years in various capacities, including 8 years with a special access program that recruited from special operations units and trained personnel for sensitive operations. My official record shows service in military intelligence and signals analysis. My actual record is classified at a level that none of you have access to." The three men stared at her. Holloway's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. Torres looked like someone had just explained a magic trick. Grimes's face hardened. "You're telling me you were an operator," Grimes said slowly. "A Tier 1 operator." "I'm telling you I had specialized training in precision rifle work, close target reconnaissance, and direct action operations in denied areas. I'm also telling you that I retired from that life 18 months ago, took a contractor position specifically because I wanted to be far away from operational work, and had no intention of ever picking up a rifle in anger again." She paused. "But I wasn't going to let soldiers die when I could prevent it." Holloway sat down on the edge of her roommate's empty cot, rubbing his face with both hands. "Jesus, you were on that ridgeline. That was you." "That was me. You walked 4 kilometers in 100-degree heat, climbed a ridgeline that would challenge a mountain goat, and then proceeded to systematically destroy a Taliban ambush from 800-plus meters away." Holloway looked at her with something approaching awe. "What unit were you with? SEAL Team 6? Delta? ISA? I can't tell you that, sir. The program I worked for doesn't officially exist, and even acknowledging its existence would violate several federal laws and my security clearances." "Security clearances you still have?" Grimes asked sharply. "In a manner of speaking. I signed documents when I left that program. Those documents remain in effect for the rest of my life." Torres let out a low whistle. "So you're like, what, a ghost? One of those people who does things that never get reported?" "I was," Sarah corrected. "Past tense. I left that world. I don't want to be that person anymore." "Why?" Holloway asked. The question wasn't judgmental, just curious. "You're clearly skilled. You probably saved a dozen lives today. Why walk away from that?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. These men had bled today, had lost soldiers under their command, had experienced the chaos and terror of combat. They deserved more than a platitude. "Because it changes you," she said finally. "Every mission, every target, every decision about who lives and who dies. You tell yourself it's necessary, that you're serving your country, that the people you're killing deserve it, and maybe that's all true. But it still changes you, piece by piece, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person looking back." She met their eyes. "I needed to stop before I lost myself completely." The room fell silent again. Outside, the call to evening prayer drifted across the valley from the nearby village, the melodic Arabic words carried on the wind. It was a sound Sarah had heard in a dozen different countries, in a dozen different contexts, some peaceful and some decidedly not. Grimes cleared his throat. "Here's my problem, Ms. Chen. You violated about 100 regulations today. You left the FOB without proper authorization, you engaged in combat operations as a civilian contractor, you employed a weapon that probably isn't registered with our armory, and you did all of this without any command approval or operational oversight." "Yes, sir, I did. I should be filing paperwork to have your contract terminated and possibly have you prosecuted. Yes, sir, you should. But," Grimes continued, "you also saved the lives of multiple American soldiers who would likely be dead right now if not for your intervention. Captain Holloway and Sergeant Torres have both stated unequivocally that your actions prevented what would have been a catastrophic situation." He paused. "That puts me in a difficult position." Sarah said nothing. She'd been in difficult positions before, had navigated the bureaucratic aftermath of operations that were even more questionable than today's impromptu Overwatch mission. She knew how these conversations went. "I need to know something," Grimes said. "Are you still operationally capable? Could you do this again if necessary?" "Sir, I just told you I don't want to be that person anymore. I heard what you said. I'm asking what you can do, not what you want to do." Grimes's voice was firm but not unkind. "Because the reality is that we have soldiers operating in one of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan, with inadequate support and intelligence that's often a week out of date. If you have skills and experience that could help keep those soldiers alive, I need to know about it." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then at Holloway and Torres. She could see it in their faces, the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found a resource that could give their soldiers an edge. The military was always desperate for advantages, for capabilities that could tip the balance in their favor. but she'd walked away from this world for a reason. Had spent 18 months rebuilding her sense of self, learning how to be something other than a weapon aimed at America's enemies. Going back, even temporarily, would mean surrendering that progress. "I can help with intelligence analysis," she said carefully. "Planning, terrain assessment, threat evaluation. I know this area better than anyone on this FOB, and I can provide insights that might save lives. But I'm not going to become your personal sniper, sir. What I did today was an emergency response to an immediate threat. It's not a role I'm willing to adopt permanently, even if it means more soldiers die who you could have saved," Grimes pressed. "That's not fair, sir. War isn't fair, Ms. Chen. You know that better than most." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the implication that she was choosing her own peace of mind over the lives of soldiers. It was a guilt trip, and not even a subtle one. But it was also true. Every decision to not help, to stay on the sidelines, carried a potential cost measured in blood. "I'll make you a deal," she said finally. "I'll provide whatever intelligence and analytical support I can. I'll help with mission planning, threat assessment, anything that doesn't require me to personally pull a trigger. If there's another emergency situation where immediate action is needed and no other assets are available, I'll consider responding, but I'm not going to become a regular operational asset. I won't go back to being what I was." Grimes studied her, weighing his options. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The value of her skills versus the complications of having a contractor with a mysterious past, operating in a gray area of regulations and authority. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what's going to happen. Officially, today's Overwatch fire came from an Army sniper team that was operating in the area on a separate mission. That's the story we're putting in the after-action reports. That's what we're telling the battalion commander, and that's what everyone on this FOB is going to believe. Your name doesn't appear anywhere. Your involvement never happened." "Sir," Holloway started. "That's how it's going to be, Captain." Grimes cut him off. "Ms. Chen's background is classified, and I'm not going to trigger a security review by putting her in official reports. Besides, she's right that she violated about 100 regulations. If we officially acknowledge what she did, we'll have to deal with the consequences, and I'd rather keep her available to help us than see her sent home or prosecuted." He turned back to Sarah. "Unofficially, I'm going to start bringing you into mission planning sessions. Not in any official capacity. You'll still be the logistics contractor, but I want your input on operations. Your knowledge of this area is clearly extensive, and I'd be a fool not to use it. In exchange, I need you to promise that if we face another situation like today, and you're the only asset available to respond, you'll do what needs to be done." "Within reason," Sarah said. "I'm not agreeing to become a door kicker or go on raids." "Fair enough. Do we have a deal?" Sarah considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, sir, we have a deal." Grimes extended his hand and Sarah shook it, the gesture sealing an agreement that would have given military lawyers heart attacks if they'd known about it. An off-the-books arrangement with a contractor who had an operational background that officially didn't exist, promising support that couldn't be acknowledged. It was exactly the kind of gray area improvisation that the military ran on in places like Afghanistan, where the rule book often didn't account for reality. "Good," Grimes said. He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Ms. Chen, thank you. Whatever happened today, whatever the official story is, you saved American lives. That matters more than any regulation you might have bent." After Grimes left, Holloway and Torres remained. Holloway looked at her with open curiosity now, the kind of look you give someone when you realize they're far more than they appeared. "I had you completely wrong," he said. "When you were giving that briefing about the Tangi Valley, I thought you were just a contractor who'd read some reports and studied some maps. I had no idea you'd actually operated there." "That was the point," Sarah said quietly. "I wanted to be underestimated. It's easier to be invisible when people think you're not worth noticing." Torres spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "My soldiers, the ones who made it out alive today, they're going to want to know who saved them. They're going to ask questions." "Tell them it was an Army sniper team," Sarah said. "Tell them the truth doesn't matter as much as the fact that they're alive. Tell them to focus on taking care of each other and staying sharp for the next mission." "They deserve to know," Torres insisted. No, Sarah said firmly. They deserve to be alive, and they deserve to have leadership that will use every available resource to keep them alive. My identity doesn't matter. The mission matters. Taking care of soldiers matters. Everything else is just ego. Torres stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded. You really were one of them, weren't you? The ghosts. The people who win wars in ways that never get reported. I was a soldier, Sarah said. Just like you. I just happened to have a different kind of training. After they left, Sarah sat alone in her bee hut, feeling the weight of what she'd done settling over her. She'd broken her promise to herself. She'd picked up the rifle, stepped back into the role she'd tried to leave behind. Even though it had been necessary, even though it had saved lives, it still felt like a failure. She opened her footlocker and pulled out the locked case, opened it, and looked at the red beret and challenge coin inside. These were symbols of who she'd been. An operator in a program so classified that most people in the military didn't know it existed. A soldier who'd operated in the shadows, doing the hard things that needed to be done but could never be acknowledged. She'd thought she'd left that life behind. Thought she could be someone else, someone normal, someone who didn't carry the weight of classified operations and confirmed kills and missions that would never appear in history books. But maybe you never really left that life. Maybe it was always there, waiting for the moment when you'd need it again. Maybe the best you could do was try to use those skills responsibly. Try to be the person who saved lives instead of just taking them. Sarah closed the case and locked it away. Tomorrow she'd return to being the contractor lady, the quiet woman with the clipboard who counted rifles and did inventory. But now Major Grimes would be pulling her into mission planning. Now Captain Holloway would be asking for her input on operations. Now she'd be walking the line between civilian and operator, between the person she was trying to be and the person she'd been trained to be. It wasn't what she'd wanted, but maybe it was what she needed. Maybe this was how she could serve without losing herself, by helping soldiers prepare, by sharing knowledge, by being the safety net that caught them when plans went wrong. She could live with that, could live with being the ghost in the background, the invisible guardian who kept people alive without needing recognition or glory. It wasn't perfect, but in war, nothing ever was. 3 days later, Lieutenant Marcus Webb appeared at her office door. His arm was in a sling. He'd taken shrapnel during the ambush, and his expression was markedly different than the last time they'd spoken. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility. "Miss Chen, do you have a minute?" Sarah looked up from her computer. "Of course, Lieutenant. Come in." Webb entered, closing the door behind him. He stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, then spoke in a rush. "I wanted to apologize for what I said the other day, in the armory, about contractors, about you. It was disrespectful and unprofessional, and I'm sorry." Sarah set down her pen. "Apology accepted, Lieutenant. I also wanted to thank you," Webb continued. "I don't know exactly what happened out there, and Major Grimes said there was an Army sniper team in the area that helped us out. But Sergeant Torres told me that you'd briefed them on that exact terrain, that you'd warned Captain Holloway about some of the positions we ended up taking fire from." He paused. "If we'd listened better to your briefing, maybe we wouldn't have walked into that ambush in the first place." "You did fine, Lieutenant," Sarah said gently. "Combat is chaos. Plans never survive first contact with the enemy. What matters is that you adapted, kept your people together, and brought most of them home alive. That's good leadership." "I lost 2 men," Webb said, his voice cracking slightly. "Rodriguez and Kim. They died during the evacuation, bled out before we could get them stabilized." Sarah's chest tightened. She'd known there were casualties, but she hadn't known the details. Rodriguez and Kim. 2 names she'd never forget. 2 soldiers she hadn't been able to save. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Losing people under your command is the hardest part of this job. It never gets easier no matter how many times you go through it. You sound like you've been there." "I have." Webb was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can I ask you something, off the record?" "You can ask, I might not answer." "That sniper who helped us. The one who was dropping Taliban fighters from like 1,000 meters away. Major Grimes says it was an army team, but Torres thinks it was one person. And the armory sergeant mentioned that you'd signed out some equipment recently, including a rifle case. He looked at her directly. Was it you? Sarah held his gaze, her expression neutral. The official report says it was an Army sniper team, Lieutenant. That's what happened. But unofficially? Unofficially, Sarah said carefully. What matters is that someone was watching over your soldiers when they needed help. Whether that someone was an Army team or something else doesn't change the outcome. 2 of your men still died. Others are still alive who might not have been. Focus on taking care of the living and honoring the dead. Everything else is just details. Webb nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Right. Details. He straightened up, offering her a salute despite her civilian status. Thank you, Ms. Chen, for everything. After he left, Sarah returned to her work, but her mind was elsewhere. Rodriguez and Kim. 2 soldiers she hadn't been able to save, despite her best efforts, despite 43 rounds fired and 35 confirmed hits. She'd been fast, but not fast enough. Precise, but not precise enough. She wondered if that feeling, the knowledge that you'd done everything right, but it still wasn't enough, ever went away. Wondered if the ghosts of Rodriguez and Kim would join the other ghosts she carried, the other names from other operations in other places. Probably. That was the cost of this work, the price you paid for operating in the space between life and death. You saved some, you lost some, and you lived with both for the rest of your life. That evening, Sarah attended a memorial service for Rodriguez and Kim, standing in the back with the other contractors, watching as Bravo Company honored their fallen. Captain Holloway spoke about courage and sacrifice. Sergeant Torres talked about brotherhood and duty. And Lieutenant Webb, his voice breaking, read a poem about soldiers who gave everything in service to something larger than themselves. Sarah listened in silence, her eyes dry but her chest tight with a grief she couldn't fully express. These weren't her soldiers. She was just a contractor now, technically not even military anymore. But they felt like hers. They felt like all the soldiers she'd watched go into harm's way over 15 years of operations, all the people she'd tried to keep alive, all the names she'd learned and sometimes forgotten, but always carried. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the sun set over the Afghan mountains, Sarah walked to the edge of the FOB and looked out at the valley. Somewhere out there, in compounds and caves and mountain passes, the Taliban were planning their next move. And here, in FOBs and outposts scattered across Afghanistan, American soldiers were preparing to meet them. It was an old war, fought in an old way, with new technology but ancient hatreds. It would go on long after Sarah was gone, long after everyone currently in Afghanistan had rotated home. That was the nature of these conflicts. They didn't end, they just evolved, generation after generation, until everyone forgot why they'd started in the first place. But Sarah wasn't here to win the war, wasn't here to change policy or achieve strategic objectives. She was here to help keep soldiers alive, one mission at a time, one decision at a time, one well-placed shot at a time if necessary. It wasn't the life she'd wanted, but maybe it was the life she was meant to live. She pulled out the challenge coin from her pocket, the one with no unit designation, just a number and a symbol. She held it up to the fading light, watching it catch the last rays of sun, then tucked it back away. Tomorrow she'd return to being invisible. Tomorrow she'd be the contractor lady with the clipboard, quiet and unimportant and easily overlooked. But tonight, for just a moment, she let herself remember who she really was. Captain Sarah Chen, ghost, operator, guardian. The invisible soldier who would always be watching, always be ready, always be there when her people needed her most, no matter the cost. Epilogue. 6 months later, FOB Hammer was quieter. Bravo Company had rotated home, replaced by a different unit with different faces, but the same mission. Major Grimes was still in the talk, coordinating operations. Sarah Chen was still in her small office, still the logistics contractor, still counting rifles and tracking supplies. But things had changed. Now, before every mission, someone, usually the company commander or the operations officer, would stop by Sarah's office. They'd spread out their maps, talk through their plans, and listen carefully when she pointed out potential issues. They never asked her operational background, never questioned why a contractor knew so much about tactics and terrain and enemy patterns. They just listened, made adjustments, and went out better prepared. The casualty rate in the sector dropped. Ambushes that would have been devastating were spotted and avoided. Enemy positions that would have caused problems were identified and neutralized. Nobody talked about why, officially, but the soldiers knew. Officers knew. Even the new units rotating through heard the stories about the quiet contractor who seemed to know everything about the valley, who gave advice that saved lives, who might, just might, be something more than she appeared. Sarah remained invisible, remained quiet, remained the person who counted rifles and did inventory and never drew attention to herself. But at night, sometimes, when the FOB was quiet and the valley was dark, she'd take out her rifle and clean it methodically, keeping it ready. Just in case. Because she'd learned something important over those 6 months, something she'd been resisting since the day she'd left the program. You could leave the life, but the life never really left you. And maybe that was okay. Maybe being the ghost, the guardian, the invisible soldier who kept watch while others slept, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how she could serve without losing herself, how she could use her skills without being consumed by them. She'd never have glory, never have recognition, never have people know her name or understand what she'd done. But the soldiers she helped would go home to their families, would see their children grow up, would have futures that they might not have had without her quiet intervention. And in the end, that was worth more than any medal, any commendation, any official acknowledgement. That was worth everything.